Welcome to Sivako, Road to Avatar. My name is Shaun Alexander, and I'll be your guide to the world of Pandora and beyond. To support this show, head on over to www.patreon.com/avatarpod, where you can become a patron and gain access to exclusive content. Joining me today, I have a very special guest. Special guest, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Alex. I'm ThatLazySnail on Instagram.
And you're well. First of all, I think the main reason that we should talk about is why are you on the podcast? Like, what's your relationship to Avatar?
So I'm a really big Avatar cosplayer. Avatar cosplay and like specifically Navi cosplay is kind of my brand. It's the costume that I'm the most well known for, and it's also the costume that I probably spend the most time making and wearing. So Avatar has kind of become like my cosplay identity in a sense.
And it's quite the sort of thing you have to commit to as well, I can imagine. But before we get too deeply into it, I was going to ask you, how did you actually first get into Avatar?
So I got into Avatar when the movie came out in 2009. I was 9, and my dad took me to see it for my birthday in IMAX 3D, which is the way that you have to see it, right? And I just loved it. Like, I mean, there's something really magical about Pandora and the way that Pandora can take you to another world. And I really connected with Natiri specifically. She was one of the first really great female role models I think that we saw in that era. That was like those like early mid 2000s, right? You didn't have a lot of like really strong warrior women on screen, and so I saw her and I was like, that's that's gonna be my favorite character for probably the rest of my life. Um, and so I wanted to dress up as a child, but that was kind of vetoed by my parents because I was 9 and they kind of look like they're naked. Um, so it's something that kind of stuck with me for a while, and then I always really liked the movie, but it didn't really get super into it again until probably I want to say 2017, 2018 when I went to Disney World and they have the World of Avatar, right?
Mhm.
And I went on Flight of Passage, and they do this thing on the ride where, and spoilers for the ride if people listening to this haven't, watched a ride through of it, where they match you to like an avatar that they've like generated. And I saw that and I was like, oh, I could make a costume of that, and it could be me as an avatar, as Navi. And I did it. And I thought that the costume was so cool and so fun that I decided to compete with it at a couple different competitions after making it and then revamping it. Um, and I won. And it's been the most popular costume that I've had ever. And it's also the costume that I just feel the coolest in. So I've kept going with it.
And now, obviously, since then, we've now had the release of a whole new movie and a whole lot of other inspiration for you, I imagine, as well.
Oh yeah. Well, I love telling people that when I wore the costume, because I was wearing it in the kind of the lull in between, right? Was really when I started wearing the costume a lot. And every time I would go to a convention, I would get people coming up to me and they go, "Do you ever think the second movie is going to come out? Do you really think they're going to make the sequel?" And I would always be like, it really doesn't matter, but I always hope they do. And now here we are. I got the new one, and I've got my Tsureya cosplay is up on my Instagram, and my Kiri cosplay is up on my Instagram, and I'm currently working on a Loak costume as well.
Ooh, that's very exciting. And I gotta say, I adore it. I think your costumes are incredible. It's so fun to see, and it's also really great to see. Like people really take to cosplay for Avatar as well. I think it gives people a chance to embody these characters in a very unique way, which it's a big ask to do as well.
Yeah, I really love seeing people do their own, kind of like what I did, their own Navi, where they take elements from their own culture or the things that they love about the Navi cultures, and make their own characters with it. Especially on TikTok, this is a huge thing of people generating and creating their own Navi. Or I actually saw a girl recently who does her own recom, which is really cool. Um, and I really love that because it allows people to kind of expand on this huge world that Cameron has given us, right? And build themselves into it in a very unique and wonderful way.
Yeah, and I think the world of Avatar is so inviting and makes you want to be a part of it. So being able to find a way to put yourself into it in some way, whether that is to make your own costume and embody it, or it's creating your own character for that world, yeah, that's a great way to feel more a part of it.
Yeah, it's definitely my favorite. One of my favorite elements of the Avatar community is seeing all the people's responses to it in costumes.
Mm. And that's a really good point that we're actually our main topic of today is to talk about the costume design of Avatar. So this was something that you definitely knew that you wanted to talk about. We sort of like were going back and forth and sort of like trying to figure out what to talk about. And this seemed like such an obvious thing to discuss because I think it's really underappreciated element of the film. Would you agree on that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I love telling. So I have a lot of friends, but a lot of them work in costumes, and because I got my degree in costume technology, which is like costume production, basically. So I have a degree in how to make costumes. And so a lot of my social circles are people who make costumes for a living, and they casually watch Avatar. They're not huge fans or anything, right? They all watch it because they're friends with me. Um, and I love telling them that all of the costumes for the movie were actually made physically, before, not just in CG, right? But Deborah Scott and her team of costume people actually built the costumes physically for the movie. And I love seeing my costume friends' faces light up because they're like, oh, that makes it so much cooler that like there's a physical object that you can get your hands on and hold and that you can wear. And I think that that's something that is really underappreciated about the movie because obviously we know that it takes a huge amount of manpower to make a movie like Avatar, but Cameron didn't have to have people come in and physically make the costumes for his movies. But he did, right? We could have had a situation of like, oh, well, they're all CG anyways, so why do they need physical costumes? But it creates a whole like sub industry within the movie itself of these costume artisans and allows them to really kind of show their skills and like make art.
Yeah, and I think costume design is often sort of underappreciated as an art form itself, anyway, which is criminal. I think costume design is such an interesting element in telling a part of the story. And I think a lot of filmmakers, the best filmmakers, use costume in exciting ways to tell a story. And I think Cameron's one of those people.
Yeah, I totally think that one of the incredible elements of especially The Way of Water. I noticed it a lot more in The Way of Water than you even noticed it in the original Avatar is how costumes are used to develop characters. Specifically in The Way of Water, Natam and Natiri are like really good examples of how costume is being used to kind of visually tell us how they're feeling. And you can see people kind of picking up on this when you like are scrolling through social media and stuff. But there's a couple things I noticed that really stand out to me that I haven't seen people talking about that I'd like to talk about.
Yeah, go ahead. Let's go for it. Let's dive in.
Yeah, so one thing that Natiri has both in the first movie and also in The Way of Water is she has these really cute little like feathers behind her ear. Um, and she they're really noticeable in the first movie at the very end when Awa like hears Jake and and sends all of her creatures to defend the Tree of Souls because her hair's kind of pulled back in those scenes, and so you can see these little feathers. But she has them throughout the whole movie, and she also has them in The Way of Water, but they're even less noticeable because she's often wearing her visor or she has like a headband. But this is a very like key element of her character, right? And the feathers are a callback to Seze and other things. They're similar in colors, right? And the feathers are talked about in a lot of the books. About there's a in the visual dictionary there's a note about Loak having a armband that has feathers on it and how feathers are a symbol of being like an Omatakaya warrior. But what's interesting is Netaim also has these feathers in the same spot right behind his ear like that. So he's kind of dressing up like his mom a little bit. And it's telling us of how maybe he has a better relationship with Natiri than he does with Jake, as a lot of the way he dresses and behaves kind of mimics her. So not only is he doing his hair really similar to her, he's got his hair in those braids and everything, which is pretty typical for Omaticaya, but also we also know that Omaticaya men tend to shave the sides of their head, and he doesn't do that, even though he's an adult, right? Which is what we see pretty consistently throughout the movies. Even Jake, now with his locks, has shaved sides. They're just not always visible. And we see it with Loak as well, right? So Loak has the shaved sides, or at least a shaved side, right? And Nateam doesn't. So he's clearly kind of mimicking his mom a little bit. But he's also one of the only characters who doesn't transition into wearing reef people clothes. And Natiri is also one of the characters who doesn't transition into wearing Metkina clothes. She wears stuff that is slightly more reef adjacent as the movie progresses, but for the most part, a lot of her stuff is still elements of the forest. So leaves and wooden beads, not shells, right? And Natam actually never wears any new, per se, clothing when he joins the Metkina. He's always wearing stuff that we've seen him in the Omaticaya parts of the movie. So it's kind of giving us a little visual storytelling about how he's not adjusting and he doesn't want to be there. He's being a dutiful son, right? He's not causing problems, but he's also still really holding on to his old life, right? As is Natiri.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. And I think we're obviously going to get a little bit into spoilers here, talking about certain moments from the film, which is that his during his death scene is that he talks about wanting to go home, and I think that's almost a reflection on that to say, look, yeah, this as a character, he never let go of home, and the same way Natiri is quite similar in that. Well, obviously, she has the biggest connection to the forest more than anyone else. And I thought it was really interesting that sort of parallel between Natiri and Netayam. I think that's incredible storytelling. I think it's so interesting to see. And I think you can see that similarity between Jake and Loak as well in terms of their character, but also I think they do have similar looks.
Yeah, and I love that. I love the parallels visually that the costumes are giving us between Loak and Jake. And Loak is the quickest to adapt, right? Even more so than Jake. Like he's down with it. He gets there, he's like, I found a girlfriend, I got a whale, I got a space whale. Um, I am ready. I never fit in back where I was anyways. And he's also one of the characters that we first see adopt Matt Kahina clothing as well. His necklace changes. He's one of the first ones that has a clothing change. And what's interesting to me about Loak's necklace is that he's still very clearly trying to keep a little bit of his old style, right? He's still using the claws and the same kind of color scheme, but he's very quick to be like, no, I now have, the Met Kigina. I can't remember what the visual dictionary says that it's like a tooth of a skimwing, maybe, or something. And originally his first necklace is a Ikran claw. Um, but he's definitely like, nah, I fit in here better. And we start to see that with not only like is he tying his hair back, but also he's changing his clothes. And obviously his story arc revolves around that.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to see. Yeah, this is sort of the showing of being like, yeah, look, storytelling can be shown through costume as well. It doesn't need to be sort of something that's just passed over. And I certainly think that there is a habit, especially films that are CGI heavy, not to pay attention to costuming as much because it's something that's just thrown on in post at times. And I don't want to rag on Marvel too much right now, but the sort of reappearing, disappearing suits,
Oh
which sort of
yeah.
which is all like nanotech, which doesn't have any sort of importance or weight to them because they just appear, disappear out of thin air. Whereas I remember like early Marvel films, there's a lot of importance to the costume because it'd be like, oh, I haven't got my like Iron Man hasn't got his suit. Oh, I need to go and get my suit, or my suit's breaking, so I need to sort this out while middle of a fight. And I think
Yeah.
there's an importance to what costuming can be in that sense.
Yeah, and you can see it in some Marvel films, I think, like Doctor Strange, because their costumes are physical. Um, it also helps the actors a lot. I think, and that's the other thing you kind of see with Avatar is the actors do get their hands on the costumes, right? And it really helps them build their character and how their character interacts with the world. Costumes, and in my experience working in costumes, are something that is a bridge between the world you're trying to create and the actor who's trying to create a character, right?
Mm.
It's I've dressed actors for theater. I worked backstage on dressing actors for productions, theater productions, right? And sometimes it makes all the difference for them to just be able to put on the costume that their character has. And I was specifically working on a production of Oresteia, and one of the actors was like, "Yeah, when I put the robe on, he had this like big red velvet robe. He was like, I feel like a scary judge." And I was like, "That's what you need, right?" And having that, I think, is it's helpful because you can see the way that your character exists in their world, right? And Marvel actors sometimes don't have the benefit of that because they're in a blue suit or a green suit or whatever. And I think it kind of does a disservice to not only the film but also to the actor because having that is helpful.
You know what? I think you made such a good point there. And talking about theatre, I think the filming process of something like Avatar: The Way of Water must have felt quite like theatre in terms of what they were doing. There is, minimal staging at times, and it's a lot of, acting in the costume. And I think, yeah, it sort of reminds me seeing those behind the scenes of when I did drama back in school, of what theatre performances were like. And I think as well, I think when you mentioned about someone putting on the costume and feeling that power, I think I can see that. And we've talked about how we love this costume and especially this actor, Cliff Curtis, when he has the Tonawari costume on in the behind the scenes, he looks so good in it, and you can tell he enjoys wearing it.
Yeah, and he's totally like, I mean, I I can't speak for him because I am not him. I do follow him on Instagram and I have seen him talk about it a little bit, but the impression that I get is that he put that costume on, he was like, "No, I feel powerful and I feel like a 10-foot tall alien that is riding a giant alligator flying fish thing and I'm about to absolutely murk some whalers." Like he totally radiates that energy and the costume that they created for him totally radiates that energy as well. And having those two things come together in that image not only I think helps the CGI artisans create that character and the way that he's going to look and the way that he's going to move, but also helps him embody it when he's acting. And
Mm.
I mean, he's killing it.
Oh yeah,
He's
and
killing it.
he really is. And I definitely say to anyone, have a look at those behind the scenes videos, see Cliff Curtis in that costume, and you can always see, like, if you see other behind the scenes interviews with him, there is almost like a switch between the two, and I love it because, yeah, I can tell that he feels that power, and I think that's such a good thing that Deborah Scott and her team has been able to do in making those actors feel at home in their roles, to understand their characters better through the costumes they're wearing.
Yeah, and she's doing such a beautiful job of doing that and also telling a story about not only the characters but also the space that they're in, the world that they live in, and really bringing us into Pandora with it, right? There's not a single costume piece in either of the Avatar movies that I look at and go, "No, that doesn't fit in here," right? Sometimes I watch movies and I'll see and this is something that only I would notice as someone who works in costumes, right? My parents frequently get frustrated with me when we're watching movies and I'm like, "That doesn't look right." And they're like, "Why did you point that out? We didn't need to know." Um, but everything in Avatar is so cohesive and it feels like it's part of the world. And it's hard to achieve that, especially when you're trying to create something like the Navi's clothing, which is something that doesn't, I mean, it kind of exists on Earth, but it's also something extremely unique because, I mean, we don't have those plants, we don't have those creatures. How are you going to replicate something that doesn't exist in a physical space?
Yeah, like you're trying to create costumes from a material that in theory doesn't exist, but you got to use similar materials that we can find, obviously, that do exist to make it look like that. So, for example, yeah, like those in from the Metcaina clan, they need to have materials in their costume that would come from where they live. They're not going to be covered in the same as the Matakayan because it would be out of place. But I think you'd hit on the head. They feel so real and so lived in, and it feels so appropriate.
Yeah, and I think Avatar and especially the costumes walk this really delicate line of, and Cameron's talked about this a little bit too, of it has to be human enough that we believe it, but not so human that it feels like we could find it on Earth.
Mm.
And I think Deb Scott has really just captured that perfectly, especially with Ronal. Ronal's clothing is something that, I mean, you can see the shells and other things that are on her clothes, and you're like, yeah, yeah, I could find that on the beach. But then there's other things like specifically the shell that is like on her headpiece. There's no mollusk on Earth that has a shell that looks quite like that. Or she has these, I think they're shells, but they also kind of look like coral on one of her skirts. And Deb Scott did just post this on her Instagram, so if you're wondering what I'm talking about, you can find it there. Um, they're purple and it's in this like grass skirt, and that looks not quite earthly, right? It looks like it could be something that's alive, maybe a piece of coral, but it doesn't look like anything that I've seen before. And so she really does walk this line of like it's earth but not quite, and it's human but it's not quite, in a way that really just captures you, and you're like, oh. And as a cosplayer, I'm like, how can I replicate it? And I spend all my time thinking, oh well, they 3D printed it, I can't 3D print it, so how am I going to find, you know, a seashell that looks like this seashell and then maybe carve it or something to make it look like that. And
Yeah, I was gonna say it must be quite the challenge for you to see these costumes and be like, "Oh, I've got a lot of work ahead of me to try and replicate this." But obviously, as well, you got the challenge of being that, for example, this film's still in theaters. It's you're basically referencing a lot of trailers, still images from promotions, and maybe the odd uh, dodgy picture taken on a phone, but.
yeah, I was gonna say the blurry 3D, like someone went to see the movie in 3D and took a picture of it with their like 2009 cell phone, and
Mm.
I can see it in the like pixels.
But yeah,
Yeah.
it's quite the challenge you've sort of got for yourself to sort of replicate this. But yeah, where do you even start on a task like that? So, for example, for your Kiri costume, where did you first start with it?
So I went through a lot of trial and error with Kiri because initially I wanted to do the look that she has when she's first learning to swim with the Met Canina, because actually until the promotional images were released, that was the only footage that we had of her that was full body. And so that was looking at a lot of really blurry photos that were people taking pictures of a 3D movie. Um, and I had tried doing that, but because they were photos of a movie screen, there was nothing that was really the right color. And I do think that color is something that's really important for the Navi costumes, even more so than anything else, because color is what allows you to kind of gauge whether or not it looks believable on them. Because their skin is blue, sometimes when you like have something that's blue on them, it looks weird to like our eyes. So I went back and forth with that a lot. And then eventually we got the release of the promotional images and the trailer where she is doing her Awa magic powers and using the anemones to kill people. And there's a really lovely, clear photo of that, in which I was like, I'm just going to do my best to try to replicate this before the movie comes out. Of course, now that we have all of these books that tell me exactly what it's supposed to look like, I have to like change it. But I don't know. I think my thought process is always, if I lived where they lived and I had plants or whatever at my disposal, how would I go about creating something like this? And then I apply my more practical lens to it of, okay, I'm a cosplayer, I need to be able to wear it for probably 12 hours a day. it can't be made out of leaves. What can I make that's going to look like that? That's going to have enough durability that I can wear it for 12 hours a day and probably have people grab me or step on it.
Yeah, so it becomes like a practical sense as well. It can't just be about those visuals. It has to be something that you physically can wear. And yeah, I think that's a process that people, don't think about a lot of the time, especially with to do cosplay. Because yeah, if you're going to like conventions, you're in those costumes maybe for a whole weekend, and you want to be comfortable as possible.
Oh yeah. Well, and the amount of times that I've had people ask me if I had painted my whole body for my Navi costume, which is just insane to me. Like I know people who have done it, who have painted their whole body for it. They tend to wear the costume once and then never wear it again because painting your whole body is like a 6-hour process.
Mm.
Um, but the amount of people that have asked me a if I've painted my whole body, and then their second response is to come up and like touch my arm to like check
Like you were
is
lying the first time.
yeah. I'm like, okay, I'm wearing a suit. I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, this is like a big thing, guys. If a cosplayer, just look, don't touch cosplayers. By the way, don't. If they
Yeah.
don't want you to, please don't.
I mean, I'm happy to let you like touch me if you ask, but the like, are you wearing body paint and the like arm reaching towards me? It's like the beginning of a horror movie.
Yeah, well, because guess what? If I was, you've just smudged the entire thing.
Yeah.
Oh,
But that's another reason I don't wear it. I like to be able to touch things without turning them blue.
mm.
Um, you'd be surprised the amount of body paint experiences I have where I accidentally rub my nose and then whatever was on my nose is now on everything around me.
Yeah, that's a nightmare waiting to happen, especially with blue. And I can only imagine blue is not the easiest color either to wash out.
Easier than red.
Oh, that is true. Yeah, no, that I
I
do
I
know.
I also cosplay Shakti, which is even worse.
Oh no, yeah, I can imagine that one. That one is quite the nightmare. Uh, so, have you seen like a an uptick in interest in Avatar cosplay since the release of The Way of Water?
Oh yeah. So before The Way of Water, I want to say that it was like me and like four other people. In fact, I can probably like on one hand and like can probably come up with their usernames if I really sit and think about it. Um, it was not a big space, which is part of why I think I was so successful within it. Because while I do pride myself on my costumes, I'm not like the greatest cosplayer ever, and it was just a niche. There was just not a lot. And now there's so many more people that are both cosplaying it because like they love the characters or just they love the world, but also like really skilled, cosplayers that are cosplaying it because it's popular, which is a thing. And like I don't judge them. Like if you want to cosplay something because it's popular, like by all means go ahead. Um, I'm not gonna like gatekeep Avatar cosplay. Um, it's yeah, it's a very interesting space to be in terms of cosplay because there's a lot of conversation around cultural appropriation with it as well. And so there's two things that I've noticed that happen. Either there's someone who's big enough and has a large enough following already that when they do cosplay from it, they're not deterred by a lot of cruelty on the internet, is what I'm going to call it.
Mm.
Um, some of it is well-meaning criticism, and some of it is just people being trolls. It's hard to tell the difference sometimes. Um, but if they do have a large enough following, they tend to just kind of ignore that and keep going, which is great. Um, I have seen some cosplayers who cosplay it and then they have a really small following, but because the movie is really popular, their video or their post gets a lot of traction and they receive a lot of hate, and then they don't post about it or cosplay from it anymore. And it's kind of sad to see that happen because there are ways to, you know, cosplay from Avatar and be respectful and be aware of what you're doing, right? In
Mm.
terms of cultural appropriation and stuff. There's a really huge controversy in the cosplay community surrounding the Met Kaina tattoos. and whether or not you should be allowed to paint them on your face if you are doing a costume. And I am not Maori, and I do not have say on whether or not it is cultural appropriation. And I personally will not cosplay Ronal or anyone who does have the tattoos for that specific reason, because I don't really think it's personally, I don't think it's appropriate, because uh, moko and those cultural tattoos are a closed practice, which is a little bit different from something like hair, which can be considered cultural appropriation, but is also not a closed practice of a specific cultural community, right? Um, and so I've seen a lot of people who do Ronal, who do the tattoos, and get a lot of hate for it. And it's a very complicated conversation.
Yeah, of course, because there, and I think it's because there are different levels to it as well. Obviously, there's different aspects to think of, and I think you're right in terms of saying there are different elements to consider and cultures that are in play here. That yeah, you need to be appropriate in what you are showing and displaying, and yeah, whether it's appropriate for yourself to do it. And this
Yeah,
this is a conversation that both of us feel like we shouldn't be having because obviously we're not the experts on this.
no,
And
but I do think as a cosplayer, it is something I have to think about a lot, especially in regards to cosplaying cultures that are heavily inspired by non-white groups.
mm,
Um, and taking that into account and thinking about that, and then also, I'm not the expert on it, but I do try to do my research on the costumes that I am wearing and where the cultures potentially that are inspiring them are from and their background and things like that, so that if someone comes into my comments or something and says, "You don't know anything about this," I don't have the, "Well, no, I don't know anything about it." I have the, "Well, I tried," kind
yeah,
of remark, instead of the, "I just went into it ignorant and blind."
yeah. And I think that's a really good point is that for those who are sort of getting into the cosplay and costume side of Avatar, yeah, do there are resources out there to look into to find out where the inspirations were drawn from, to understand a little bit more about those cultures. And if you want to dive in deeper to like find out more about those cultures yourself, you know, speak to the people from those communities and those cultures so you can understand it better yourself and understand why those things are appropriate to them and maybe not for us.
Yeah. And also it's just a great opportunity to learn about a culture that's not your own, right? I
Hmm.
mean, if nothing else, one thing cosplaying Avatar has taught me is a lot about both indigenous and African and Polynesian culture. Just because I'm doing research on it so that I'm aware of, what exactly it is I'm doing
Yeah,
and what
and
things are and are not cultural appropriation.
yeah, and I think that's a big discussion that Avatar has a lot of the time whenever Avatar's discussed as well in regards to different cultures because arguments against Avatar often stem from discussions about cultural appropriation and is Avatar uh, showing some form of racism of sorts. And I think it's discussions that are worth listening to and having because yeah, every opinion can be valid in some way or the other. It's worth listening to those different views.
And I think that's also a big theme of Avatar is respecting the voices of indigenous people
Mm.
and,
I think if
respecting their autonomy.
yeah, yeah, and I think that's the as you said, that's sort of like its big message is, listen to others and try to understand other people's cultures.
Yeah. And it I think it does a really great job of it. I've had
Yeah,
some really interesting conversations with conservative relatives of mine who are very closed-minded, is what the word I'm going to use. Um, and I've talked to them about Avatar, and I've been like, "Hey, you should watch this movie." And you come away from that movie rooting for the Na'vi, not for the humans, right?
I
If
hope
you're rooting
so.
for the humans, I really have concerns. But it really provides some valuable perspective on how we treat other people and the ways in which we can be better. and that's why I love it.
Yeah, I think it's a film about, yeah, having empathy, and it's a film that wants to have empathy for others, and I think that's a good thing to have nowadays.
Yeah, we live in a rather vicious world as of
Yes,
late.
yeah, unfortunately so. So having things like, yeah, like to come together over common shared interests, such as the film Avatar, through costume, through language, through just enjoying the film. Yeah, it's nice to have something shared in that way.
Yeah, and I think I don't know. I just going back to the kind of theatrical nature of the film. I
Hmm.
think sometimes it's nice to have information imparted in a way that it is just enjoyable to consume, and not everything needs to be a dark, gritty, uh, Oscar-worthy movie necessarily for it to convey a meaningful message.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we need nowadays. Actually, as well, is to have those messages, spoke to us, and it's not just messages about culture. It can be messages about, global things like climate change. It could be about whaling. It could be, yeah, all sorts. But it's shown in a way which is accessible for a wider group. You know, it's all well and good an Oscar movie coming out, but if only an odd few thousand people were going to see it because it's a dark, grim telling of a vicious story, but then Avatar's able to get to 2 billion people. Yeah, I feel like Avatar does a good job of being able to put those messages across.
Yeah, and speaking on the whaling note, and circling back around to costumes again, this is something that I noticed when I saw the movie last week again. All of the whaling equipment that they're using, which I think is a really interesting commentary on current whaling practices in our actual Earth world, has Japanese writing on it. And I don't know how many people know this, but Japan is, and I say this as a deep lover of Japan, as someone who's doing my master's and PhD work on East Asian cultures and languages. I'm not like hating on the Japanese people, um, but Japan is the biggest whaling industry in the world.
Hmm.
And so I think Cameron's choice to have the whaling equipment and clothing and life jackets and things all have Japanese writing on them is very, very poignant. And again, another excellent example of costumes as a storytelling tool. It means that the Tolkien killers, right, are getting their equipment made and imported to Pandora from Japan.
Yeah, and I think it's such an obvious sort of like connection to Cameron's own sort of love of the ocean and his desire to sort of save the oceans as best he can. And yeah, to be able to sort of call out in a way to be like, hey, look, whaling's bad, and sorry to say this, but Japan, you're the worst for it right now. This is a way of doing it in a way.
Yeah, and also speaking of dark and gritty movies, there's some really great documentaries about Japan's dolphin. Oh my gosh, I can speak, I promise. Dolphin hunting practices that are really interesting. Um, they're very sad and dark and gritty, as I was just saying. But if it is something that interests you, it is definitely worth researching because the whaling industry, and I think Cameron does a really good job of kind of pointing this out, is kind of a catch-22 for the people doing it, specifically dolphin hunting. Dolphins have such high levels of mercury in them because they eat other fish and we dump a lot of mercury into our ocean. And the more fish you eat, the more mercury you accumulate. So actually, it's not feasible for humans to eat dolphin meat because it has such high mercury in it that it basically kills us. Um, but Japan has this huge dolphin meat industry that they're trying to like push the dolphin meat into like their public school food and other things like that because they hunt so much of it that they don't know what to do with it, but people don't want to eat it because it's bad for them. And it kind of reminds me of when in Avatar: The Way of Water, they're talking about Amrita and they're like, "Oh, it stops human aging." And I'm like, "Why is that appealing?" The premise that you can never die. I don't find that appealing personally. I would not like to live forever. That would be horrible. Um I am very much with the Na'vi on all energy is only borrowed and someday you got to give it back. I would not want to live forever. But I think that that's going to be something that hopefully we talk about a little bit more in the next movie as well, is this concept that if you never die, does your life actually have meaning, right? So again, a catch-22. They're hunting the Tulkun to get the Emrita that makes it so they never age, but is that actually going to help them, or is it just going to make them more miserable?
Yeah, and that's a plot line I'm really looking forward to see develop a bit, because I think it's really interesting when you consider the recoms existing within this world as well, which is another form of extending your life in some way or the other. Although it sort of from from the way of water, it seems to just suggest that once you become a recom, you're a new person, really.
Yeah, I love I Quaritch's character is actually I really hated Quaritch in the first movie, which I know you're supposed to, but I always felt like he was kind of boring, a very two-dimensional villain, which was his function, right? He was designed to be very two-dimensional, but he was one of those things where it's like, okay, you don't really have any reason for me to like feel any kind of anything towards you except for extreme anger because you're murdering people. But in the new movie, I think his character is so fascinating because he's Quaritch, but he's not. And the relationship that he has with both Spider and also just Pandora, now that he is Navi and now that he can plug in the way that you only can if you have, the crew or the Tehelu, creates such an interesting character conundrum for him. And again, going back to the costumes, you can totally see it in his costuming as well. Like, they start out and they're on full gear, right? Shoes, floor length, like uh, full length pants, long sleeves, which is all good tactical gear and totally makes sense in the context of if you're military, you want to protect yourself from the elements. And as he's trying to uh, hunt down Jake, he's like, "Oh, we got to go full Navi, right? Eat the food, speak the language." First of all, costumes aside, speaking the language is totally unnecessary. And that was a really moment where I was like, "Oh, so he's like decided that he's like integrating now. He's joining up." Because there's no logical reason for them to have to be able to speak that. They have Spider. They don't need to speak Navi. Um, but he also like when he says that, and all of the recoms kind of do this to different extremes. They start ripping their pants, not like they're wearing shorts, like they've like ripped the bottom of their pants off. Um, which I think is a very interesting costume choice because I have no doubt that the RDA would provide them with shorts if they asked for it. Um, so they are really like committing to it, right? They're like, okay, we're not going to waste. We're not going to get a new pair of shorts. We're going to use the pants that we already have and we're going to alter them to be the way that we want. Leaning into the like no waste mindset of the Navi, right? And they're not wearing shoes and they're not wearing shirts anymore. They're just wearing their tactical vests. Although I think um, Z Dog is wearing a tank top because she, I guess, didn't fully commit to the bit and go like tits out for the whole thing. Um, but yeah, there's some interesting costume choices in terms of like also Quaritch mimicking Jake a little bit and what he wears as well. And especially in the motions that they have surrounding reloading their guns and the way that becomes a recurring interaction with their costume piece, right? They run out of ammo and they're like tapping their chest looking for their clip. And that's also an interesting thing because we see Jake do that before we see it happen to Quaritch, and then later we see it happen to Quaritch. And it's again using props and costumes as a way to be like, look how similar they are. Look how they're mirroring each other. And Quaritch's storyline in this movie very much mimics Jake's story in the first movie, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's something we're going to see continue to develop as well going forward. Depends which way they want to take Quaritch, but it feels like there's hints towards some sort of maybe not redemption, but certainly something else other than just being purely like an RDA crony.
Yeah, when I took my friend to see the movie, we had this really interesting discussion about how we think that the only logical end to Quaritch's storyline is for him to die, because he will never be human again, and he can never go back to that world, right? But he also will never be accepted amongst the Na'vi because he's done so much to hurt them, right? How could he find community among them? And where is he going to fit? Because the humans don't really want the recoms, right? Like the recoms are a tool for them. They're not really like a, they don't see them as people, I don't think, in the same way. And it's kind of, you kind of get that from, oh my God, what's the general's name? I'm totally blanking.
Yeah, I'm forgetting her. Is it?
Ardmore? Is it Ardmore?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, and she, the way she talks to him is like she's not, I don't know, it's almost like she's not talking to a person. It's like she's talking to a computer or something. It's very, and maybe that's just military speak, but it felt to me like she was very detached and she was totally willing to let all of them die, right?
Mm.
Which not particularly a military mindset always. So they're very like protect their own kind of usually. And so I think that's creates this kind of interesting void that Quaritch falls into, and all of the recoms, honestly. How can they ever find a place to exist? And what happens to them after they catch Jake? Like,
Yeah, mission over. Like, what's the plan?
yeah, do they like just go live there?
Yeah, it does leave a sort of an interesting conundrum for them, and I do wonder if this sort of plays out in a way which sees Quaritch having to find some sort of redemption, and the obvious redemption is that his one sort of connection to humanity still is through Spider.
Yeah. And I love Spider's character as well. A lot of people really hate Spider, but I saw so much of like 16-year-old me in him. Like, I don't know. Granted, I don't have near the extent of daddy issues or trauma or anything like that. But there's something really sad in his like he has a very tragic story.
Yeah. It's
He
it's
has
it's a
no
hard one.
family.
Yeah, like it's a hard one to handle, and obviously he goes on quite the journey through this because obviously he goes from being like, I don't have, yeah, like I have no family. I'm basically treated as a stray dog to the people I consider family, and but now I finally have a father figure in my life, but they're the worst person ever.
Yeah. Well, and how do you, as a character, how could you reconcile that as a person? Like, I think his actions in saving Quaritch are totally logical and believable. A lot of people are like, I can't believe the family that he grew up with and he would save the one who killed their son. Well, first of all, Quaritch did not kill Natam. It was um the other guy,
Was it
the
Wayne?
bald
Was
one.
it Wayne Fleet?
It was Wayne Fleet.
God,
Yep.
God damn it, Wayne Fleet.
Um, and second of all, what the Sullys don't see about Quaritch is all of the times that he could have absolutely just committed genocide around Spider, right?
Hmm.
And chose not to. And so we kind of see Quaritch's character growth through Spider's eyes in a little set, in a kind of sense. Um, and if the only interaction you'd ever had with Quaritch and you didn't know him, right, from the original movie, the only interaction you had with him was in his recom form, he does not seem near as bad of a guy as original Quaritch. So it's easy for the audience who's seen the first movie to look at Quaritch and go, I can't believe you would save him, right?
Hmm.
But you have to remember that Spider doesn't have that context. He was like, what, less than a year old at that time? He's
Yeah.
not remembering any of that.
Yeah. And you got to also consider that, yeah, he's, this is meant to be his father figure. You're always going to have that sort of like underlying thing of being like, sure, this guy's a bit of an asshole, but he's my dad. I might be able to change him.
Yeah, and I don't know. Oh, and this is again back to costumes. So Spider's whole character design is meant to kind of mimic Na'vi, right?
Mm.
In the way that he's dressed. He's got the loincloth, he's got the armbands, he carries the bow. He's totally doing his hair to match Jake, and not because that's any practical way for him to do his hair. Um, I have a lot of opinions on the choice of them using locks for Jake and Spider, but that aside, um, what's I think is really fascinating about Spider's costume design that I don't think a lot of people have talked about is that he actually has a song cord on his loincloth, like all of the other Na'vi do. And we see it talked about in the books a lot, the song chords, because it's obviously a huge plot point in the movie. It's a thematic thread, no pun intended, throughout the whole film. But Spider actually also has a song cord, and they all wear their song cords on their waist. And if you watch the movie again and you notice that, you'll be like, oh yeah, they do all have like a string of beads on their waist. Um, but I think it's interesting that Spider has one as well because we so often see that he's not considered Na'vi. So is Kiri the one making his song chord with him?
Mm,
How is that working? And does he sing it in Na'vi? Right? How is that part of his character? And I think that's something that like kind of sets you up a little bit for the next movie because you're like, oh, maybe we get to hear more about that. Or is it just a nice little Easter egg that Deborah Scott has left for people like me who are obsessive to see that he has that, right? But
yeah.
it's definitely an element that proves that he feels like he's one of them. So much so that not only does he dress like that and have the blue stripes, but he's actively documenting his life in the same way.
Yeah, and I think those like sort of very particular details are what bring this world to life in a way that makes it feel so real. Seeing those intricate details and the fact that they use those real costumes, so even for the characters who are become fully VFX, and we see what their costumes feel like in the water. We see what they look like when they're in movement, and it suddenly all comes to life more than it ever could just being all sketched up and then put through a computer.
Yeah. And they build the cultures that they're in too. Like all of the adult Met Kaina have their, I don't remember what they were calling them. They look like like chest guards or something, like
Mm,
backpack straps, kind of.
yeah,
Um, Tonowari obviously has one, and but Tonowari also has like a mantle that marks him as chief. But all of the adult Met Kaina boys have this strap that they wear on their chest, kind of like how all the Omatakaya have their like cummerbund that they wear. And so like they all have these coming of age pieces of clothing, and they all manifest in different ways. And it's so cool to see it, and it really fleshes out a lot of the background extra characters as well that are completely unnamed, right? You're like, oh, well, this person is a child and this person is an adult. And even though we're never explicitly told that the way that we can tell the difference between a child and an adult is this article of clothing, it's made so clear through the amount of times that we see it that we just kind of instinctively know.
yeah, and I think that's something that's vastly improved comparing the first Avatar to the new one, in which we know that in the first one, a lot of the time they did just end up having to drop in sort of very sort of plain, I guess, default versions of RV just to be like, we need to fill out the scene, but we have not got the resources to keep making new characters, so we're just going to put in a few different blanket ones here and there, and but yeah, in the Way of Water, every character has their own detailing, and I think that's just incredible.
Yeah, and I love looking at the background characters. I could watch the movie again and just like not pay attention to the main group at all. Just like looking at all the details of all of the people in the background. And we see it a lot more in the Omatakaya too, which I think, like you said in the first movie, we were kind of missing. The only time I can think of in the first movie that the extras and like background characters are really noticeable is really towards the end when we see them at the Tree of Souls with Grace and when Jake comes back as Turukmakto. And when they're visiting the other clans, we get these like unique, right, moments of here's this clan leader. And I'm gonna say Kenyi is still like my favorite character design, and I've never heard anything about her since. And I'm just waiting for her to come back because red body paint Ikran Eastern Sea Olektan is like my favorite. And silence.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully, you know what? It's one of those things where it's like you see something in it just so inspiring to look at. You're just like, man, this is something I want more of, and I probably will never get more of it, sadly.
Yeah. Well, initially they had this, what was it called? It was not Frontiers of Pandora. It was like a mobile
Oh,
game.
yeah. Is it Pandora Rising? I think.
Yeah, they had that mobile game that they were supposed to release and then they never did. That's another great example of like stunning costume design. They did these character portraits that had like a little blurb, the character's name, where they're from, and they had these beautiful drawings of all these incredible costumes from all these different clans, pulling into the lore from the Glass Shadow Cirque du Soleil show and all of that stuff. And I was like, yes, finally, more world building. And then they never released the game. I will always be salty about that.
Uh, so, as we get towards the end of the episode, I wanted to ask: is there any like final sort of costumes you want to just like really say to people? Hey, please go and check out the detailing of.
Pay attention to Tsureya in like the last hour of the movie because she gets this really cute little like tiara thing. And I think it's so endearing and no one has talked about it. I've seen all these people talking about, oh, Natiri's wearing Nateam's necklace when she visits the spirit tree or things like that. And I'm like, no one is talking about Tsureya. Tsureya has some really beautiful costumes that are kind of glossed over because she's always either standing next to Ronal or Locke. And like, I get it. Ronal is killing it in every scene she's in, but Tsureya's also doing a mighty fine job too.
Yeah. Very underappreciated. I would like to say you should all definitely go back and look at Grace Augustine in her tank top in the first Avatar because I think it's funny that she's got a personally made tank top for her university. I love
Oh yeah.
it.
Oh yeah. No, that's the I, as the leader of the Avatar program, demand that I get a Stanford T-shirt.
No one
Is
else, just me.
hilarious. Yeah.
I also like to think that she just went on to the site and was like, I'm just going to order the biggest size possible and see what happens. We'll just see if it works.
I'm gonna get a triple X, a triple XL, and then maybe it will fit.
I'll get two triple XLs, and if I put them back to back, maybe. Ah,
Yeah.
yeah, thank you so much for coming on. It's been such a fun discussion. I feel like we've gone through costume design and through all other various aspects, but it's been so exciting to sort of hear, yeah, like how exciting costume design can be and how much it can impact story.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me. I'm always down to talk about Avatar costumes for however long you would like me to.
And I'm sure we'll have you back as well because I'm can only imagine what we're going to see in the films coming up as well. There's going to be so much exciting stuff to come to.
Oh yeah, and I'm definitely gonna be buying Frontiers of Pandora and playing that, if only so that I can see all of the NPCs and what they're wearing.
Yeah. Oh, I'd love to see see that sort of because I do wonder for the new game. Do you get to create your own character, or is it a set person?
If I get to like make wear little outfits and stuff, that is all I can ask for. That would be my favorite video game there ever was because all I have to do is like dress up as a Navi in video games form.
Oh, that's what they need. They need a Sims expansion, which is Avatar.
I would pay ungodly amounts of money for that.
Yeah. So, where is the best place for people to find you?
The best place for people to find me is on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube, and my username on all of those is ThatLazySnail. So if you type in ThatLazySnail, I guarantee you a photo of me dressed up as a Navi will show up.
Awesome. And thank you all so much for having a listen today. I hope you've enjoyed this look through costume design and a little bit of cosplay too. And yeah, speak to you all again soon. Goodbye. Thank you for listening. This week's episode is dedicated to our patrons Eric Scrock and Patrick Regal. To become a patron, visit www.patreon.com/avatarpod.